The Appalachian Trail begins in Georgia and stretches all the way to Maine. It is one of the longest continuous footpaths in the world, a living artery of earth and stone that winds through mountains, forests, and valleys, places where the trees outnumber people 1,000 to 1. To many, it's a sacred escape, a long breath drawn away from the chaos of the modern world. Here, you can lose cell signal, but find yourself. You can walk for days without hearing a single car and fall asleep to the rhythm of cicadas, the hush of leaves overhead. But for every story of enlightenment, there's another that stays in the shadows. Stories that don't make it into the glossy travel blogs or hiking forums. Stories that are hard to talk about. Because even the people who lived them aren't sure what they experienced. It starts with a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a snap of a branch maybe, far enough away that you can write it off as a deer, close enough that your body doesn't believe you. And then there's the shift, the way the forest starts to feel different, as if you're being watched, not followed, watched. There's a difference. Followed is movement. Watched is stillness. Stillness so absolute it starts to press against the back of your neck. Ask the old rangers, the ones who've worked the backcountry stretches for decades, and their eyes will go quiet. Some of them will tell you about the lost hikers, but it's how they say it that stays with you. They talk like it's not just about getting lost. They talk like the trail itself can lead you away on purpose. Some say there are places where your voice won't carry. You can scream and it won't bounce back. It's like the air refuses to return the sound. One ranger, retired now, said it best. There are pockets out there. Dead zones. Not just for cell signals, for everything. He said that like it was a fact, not a theory. There are stories of people hiking in groups, then turning around to realize someone's missing. Not just gone. Gone, without sound. As if they were never there. One woman hiked with her brother. They took turns leading. She said she heard his footsteps behind her for hours. It wasn't until she reached the clearing that she realized he'd been ahead of her the whole time. You hear that a lot out here. The trail has echoes. Not the kind that bounce off rock, but the kind that mimic. The Cherokee called this land something different long before it became a mapped route. Their stories spoke of watchers in the woods. Not spirits, not animals, something else. They warned not to answer voices calling your name from the dark, especially if the voice belonged to someone you loved, especially if that person wasn't supposed to be there. Some hikers, experienced ones, have woken up at night unable to move. Not sleep paralysis. They were fully awake, eyes wide, and yet they couldn't speak, couldn't lift a finger. All they could do was listen. They describe hearing footsteps, light ones, circling the tent, over and over, never stopping, as if whatever it was wasn't passing by, it was waiting. There's an unspoken rule among some of the long-distance hikers. If your camp starts to feel wrong, if the air gets too still, if the forest seems to lean in closer while you sleep, you don't stay. Even if it means packing up in the dark and walking with only your headlamp. Because whatever you're sensing isn't just in your head. It's not nerves. It's not fatigue. It's the land. And sometimes the land wants to be alone. Some of the older shelters along the trail, they hold stories, scratched into the wood. Small carvings, initials, dates. But look closely, and you'll find other things. Symbols, phrases. One shelter deep in the Smokies has a message written in black marker on the wall. It says, "Don't look at it. Don't talk to it. Don't let it in." No one knows who wrote it. But no one's removed it either. And still, every year, hikers return. They lace up their boots, fill their packs, and set out, drawn by the beauty, the peace, the silence. But the silence out here has many faces. Sometimes it means rest. Sometimes it means you've wandered into a place where noise doesn't belong. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is keep walking. Eyes forward, don't stop, don't listen, because the trail remembers. It has seen thousands pass through, and for reasons no one understands, it doesn't let everyone leave the same way they came. This is the Appalachian Trail, and these are the legends it refuses to let go. It was Father's Day weekend, June 1969. The Martin family, William, his two sons, and his father, Clyde, had chosen to celebrate the holiday with a weekend hike in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They were near Spence Field, not far from the Tennessee-North Carolina line. It was a family tradition passed down over generations, and for the Martins, the Smokies felt like home, safe, familiar. Dennis Martin was 6 years old, a shy, bright-eyed boy with a bowl haircut and a nervous smile. He wore a red shirt that day. His mother had insisted red would help them spot him in the thick woods. She had no way of knowing just how important that detail would become. The Martins had met up with another family on the trail, also with children, and the boys decided to play, a harmless game of hide-and-seek among the low brush and mossy trunks. Dennis, always the quieter one, darted behind a bush to surprise the adults from behind. It was just a few seconds. His father said he looked away for maybe 5, maybe 10. When he called Dennis's name, there was no answer. He circled the area. Nothing. No rustling, no giggling, just the steady hum of summer insects and the distant croak of frogs. That was the last time Dennis Martin was ever seen. Within hours, a massive search was launched, one of the largest in national park history. The terrain was unforgiving. Rangers, volunteers, Green Berets, even bloodhounds were brought in. They combed through ravines, up and down steep ridges, and through the dense undergrowth that swallowed light even in midday. But Dennis had vanished. No tracks, no clothing, no remains, nothing. One ranger, he was a young man then, now long retired, still remembers that case like it happened yesterday. He spoke to us under the condition that his name wouldn't be used. He said, "I've worked over 40 missing persons cases in my time. And most of them, even the tragic ones, they left something behind. A shoe, a torn jacket, a footprint in the mud. But this, it was like the mountain just opened up and took him in." He recalled how even the dogs struggled. The scent trail went in a straight line and then just stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if Dennis had been plucked off the ground mid-step. And then there were the reports. A family, several miles down the trail, claimed they heard something strange. They said they saw a figure, large, upright, moving swiftly through the trees, carrying something over its shoulder. That sighting was never confirmed. Some dismissed it as panic-induced imagination. Others weren't so quick to write it off. You see, this part of the Smokies has long carried its own set of warnings. The Cherokee once called these lands the place where the spirits dwell. Not metaphorically, literally. There are places in the park where the air turns colder, even in midsummer. Places where compasses refuse to settle. Locals speak of wild men, of feral beings who live far from the paths, in places so remote they're almost unreachable. Generations ago, settlers told stories of creatures that watch from cliffs, waiting for travelers to separate from their groups. The ranger, all these years later, still remembers the expressions on the search team's faces, the stillness that settled in the trees on the second night. He said, "There was this moment, out there near dusk, when everything went quiet. I mean, completely quiet. No wind, no birds, no insects, and you don't get that in the Smokies. You just don't. Another ranger later confessed he thought the Mengthi Tenachi were bearer. They were being watched during the search, not by animals, something else. He said he'd never felt that way before, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. There were theories, of course, that Dennis had wandered off, fallen into a ravine, been taken by a predator, but none of the usual signs were there. No drag marks, no blood, not even a broken branch. One investigator admitted that the case didn't behave like a mountain lion attack, and certainly not like a human abduction. Those leave tracks, patterns, behavior. But this was absence, clean, total, unyielding. A member of the Green Berets who assisted with the search reportedly left early. One of the few who said nothing to the press. According to a colleague, he looked pale when he returned to base. Said only one thing: "We're not equipped for what's out there." That quote was never officially recorded. It passed from one ranger to another, a kind of whispered lore. And even now, decades later, it gets brought up in the back rooms of the ranger station. Quietly, with eyes that scan the room before speaking. The Martin family never gave up hope. They returned year after year, revisiting the place where Dennis vanished. They placed toys by trees, red shirts, little reminders in case. Somehow, he found his way back, but the mountain kept its silence. It has been more than 50 years. No remains, no evidence, just stories. Stories about a trail that seems to know more than it lets on. About a wilderness that doesn't always play by human rules. And about a 6-year-old boy who walked into the trees and never came out. The Smoky Mountains have always had their rules, unwritten ones, passed not through signs or pamphlets, but through the hush in a ranger's voice, or the glance exchanged between two hikers when the forest grows too quiet. Most who walk these trails never learn them. But for those who spend enough time here, the rules become instinct. Don't hike past dusk. Don't stray from the path. Don't set camp where the wind dies completely. Hazel Creek sits deep in the southwestern pocket of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Remote, accessible only by foot or by boat. Even among rangers, it's known as a place you don't patrol alone. In September of 2020, 2 backpackers were hiking through that area. They had planned a multi-day loop and were making their way toward Campsite 82. It's an isolated site, primitive, no shelters, nothing but flat ground, trees, and the trail. When they arrived, they immediately knew something was wrong. They heard the noise first, heavy movement, brush shaking, low huffing breaths, not the kind of cautious rustling of a deer, but something more deliberate. Closer. Then they saw it. A black bear, large, crouched low, feeding on something. At first, they thought it was a deer carcass. Then they saw the shape of a human foot. They backed away, didn't scream, didn't run, just turned and walked, trying not to draw its attention. They made it far enough to find a ranger outpost with a signal booster. The call came in just after noon. The response was immediate. When rangers arrived, the bear was still there. What they found was unsettling. The remains of a man lay partially buried beneath leaves and disturbed soil. Scattered gear surrounded the area, a torn tent, a crushed water filter. The victim had no defensive wounds. The man was later identified as Patrick Madura, 43 years old. Experienced camper. No signs of foul play. Autopsy confirmed blunt trauma consistent with a bear attack. On paper, that's where the case ends. But for the rangers who responded, it didn't feel that simple. One of them, an older ranger with over 2 decades in the park, spoke to us off record. He said, "I've seen bear attacks. They don't look like this. Bears don't usually drag the body. They don't stay near it for long unless they're starving. And this one, It didn't run. Even when we approached, it just looked at us. He paused for a long time, then said, almost in a whisper, "It wasn't guarding food. It was waiting. Bears are intelligent, yes, but this wasn't normal behavior." There was no sign of cubs nearby, no illness, and no signs of prior aggression on the trail leading in. The man's gear was intact. He hadn't tried to fight, hadn't made noise, no scuffle marks, no footprints leading away from the scene, except his own. Then there's the timeline. Rangers estimate that Madura had set up camp the evening before, but no one reported hearing anything unusual that night. Hazel Creek is a corridor used by a handful of hunters and experienced hikers in the off-season. No one saw lights, no one heard screams, only stillness. Too much stillness. A seasonal ranger who had camped at 82 years prior later reached out. She remembered something odd. Said she'd woken in the middle of the night to the sound of someone walking around her tent. Not pacing, circling. Slow, deliberate steps. She called out, thinking it was another hiker. No response. The steps continued for a while, then stopped. She unzipped her tent and looked out. Nothing. But her boot prints weren't the only ones near her camp the next morning. The prints she saw were barefoot, human-sized, but spaced far wider than they should have been. Like whoever left them had an unusually long stride. She reported it to her supervisor. He told her it was probably a prank, but the look in his eyes said something else. Hazel Creek has a reputation. Quiet, yes. Beautiful, yes. But it also has stories, old ones. Before the area was protected, scattered settlements dotted these woods. Small cabins, hand-built homesteads, isolated communities. Some vanished with time. Others vanished without explanation. There are hikers who swear they've seen flickers of lantern light off the main trail, only for it to disappear when approached. There are stories of voices calling out in the fog, mimicking the cadence of a friend or family member, but always just out of view. What happened to Patrick Madura was ruled a tragic accident, an unfortunate encounter with a wild animal. And maybe that's true. But if you ask those who were there, if you sit with them long enough, past the rehearsed statements and the clinical detachment, they'll tell you what really got to them wasn't the bear. It was what the woods felt like that day. As if something was watching the watchers. As if the violence had already happened hours before they arrived, and whatever had caused it was no longer there, but hadn't gone far. One ranger put it like this: "I've walked these woods most of my life. I know the difference between natural and unnatural, and that campsite felt wrong. The trees felt closer together. The air was heavy, and the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was waiting." The site was closed for a while, eventually reopened. But the story stuck. And now, hikers who pass by campsite 82 speak a little softer, light their fires a little earlier, and sleep with their packs within arm's reach. As if, deep down, they understand. There are places in these mountains where the rules bend, where nature doesn't act the way it should, and where sometimes something else walks the trail. Some sounds in the forest you come to expect: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the low murmur of a stream winding beneath rotting logs. These are the rhythms of the woods, predictable, familiar. But then, there are the other sounds, the ones that don't belong. The ones that arrive when the air grows still, when the sun dips below the treetops and shadows stretch long across the ground. The whistling always starts the same way. Faint, almost melodic. A simple pattern, 2 notes, sometimes 3. Soft enough to question if you heard anything at all. But then, it comes again. Closer. Not quite human, not quite animal. and always from the direction you weren't just facing. The Cherokee people have lived in these mountains for thousands of years. Their oral history runs deeper than any map, and many of their stories were not meant to entertain, but to warn. Among those stories is one that has persisted for generations, the tale of the Whistlers. Known by different names across clans, they were said to be forest spirits, never seen, only heard. Their whistles were not songs, but lures, echoes meant to draw travelers away from the trail, deeper into places they were never meant to go. Some said the Whistlers were guardians, others said they were remnants, spirits of the lost, doomed to wander, jealous of the living, and still others believed they weren't spirits at all, but something older. Something that learned the sounds of humans and used them against us. We spoke with a retired ranger now living just outside Bryson City. He's heard the stories all his life. But it wasn't until the fall of 1997 that he came face to face with the legend. He'd been assigned a remote stretch near Newton Bald Trail. A routine patrol, clear signage, check campsites, make contact with hikers, nothing unusual. That evening, just before dusk, he made camp near a ridgeline. No fire, just a small burner and a thermal blanket. He said the quiet felt heavier than usual. He chalked it up to the drop in temperature. Then, the whistling started. 2 notes, rising, then falling, from the north side of the ridge. He assumed it was a hiker, maybe someone trying to signal. He called out, no response. Whistled back, nothing. A few minutes passed. Then it came again. This time, from the south. That's when he stood up, turned on his headlamp, scanned the trees. No movement, no eyeshine, just trees swaying gently, and the unmistakable sound of breathing. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, there were no tracks. No other campers reported hearing anything, but he did, and he never returned to that section again. In the years since, other reports have surfaced. Solo hikers, night hikers, some hunters, all hearing similar sounds. A soft whistle, repetitive, usually heard after dark. Those who followed it described strange feelings, headaches, nausea, vertigo. One man, a section hiker from Virginia, wandered off trail for nearly 4 miles. He couldn't explain it. Said he felt pulled, like something was just ahead, always just beyond the next tree. He finally stopped when he tripped over a root and cut his leg. By then, his GPS tracker had failed, and his compass was spinning wildly. It took a search team 6 hours to locate him. He was only 3/4 of a mile from the trail, but in terrain so dense it took machetes to get through. A former cultural liaison for the Park Service, part Cherokee herself, once told us, "When you hear the whistlers, you don't go looking. You listen once, you listen twice, then you leave. That third whistle is not for you." She went on to explain that certain parts of the forest were traditionally avoided, not out of fear, but out of respect. The whistlers were not malevolent in every story, but they were boundary markers, a warning that you were trespassing into places untouched by light. Some park workers scoff at the stories. They cite wind patterns, bird calls, acoustic anomalies. And yes, the mountains do strange things with sound. Voices carry for miles. A snapping twig can sound like a shout in the still air. But here's the part that never quite fits: recordings. Hikers have tried capturing the whistles on phones, field recorders, trail cams, and nearly every time, the audio comes back corrupted, glitched, or silent. Like something was there, then wasn't. We were given one such file by a through hiker named Marcy. She'd heard the whistling on the Tennessee side of the trail near Fontana Lake, played us the audio, just wind and faint movement. But at the 23-second mark, there was a strange tone, low, subtle, like breath through a reed pipe, Then, total silence for the rest of the file. She swore that wasn't how she remembered it. "I know what I heard," she said. "It wasn't the wind. It was calling something, and something else was answering. There are places in the Smokies where your voice feels swallowed, where even your thoughts seem quieter, and if you're unlucky, you might hear something whisper back. The whistlers haven't gone away. They never left. They're still there, calling softly, waiting patiently, leading the curious into the dark, one note at a time. There's a certain moment in the woods, just after the light begins to fade, when the shadows sharpen and stretch in impossible ways, that hikers speak of feeling, watched, not followed, not threatened, but observed. There's no sound, no movement, just a pressure in the chest, like the forest has leaned in to listen. And in that silence, some say they've glimpsed something they weren't supposed to see. The Cherokee told stories of them, old ones, before maps, before fences. They didn't have a single name, because names gave power. But in English, they've come to be known by one: skin stealers. These were not ghosts. They were something else. Beings that could wear the face of another, take their voice, mimic their habits, but never quite get it right. According to the stories, they were drawn to conflict, to grief, to the lost. They waited at the edge of trails, studied travelers from the brush, and when a person was most vulnerable, tired, alone, uncertain, that's when they would step into the open. But they never attacked, not in the usual sense. They simply appeared as you. The first modern report came in 1972. A young man named Lewis had hiked into the Appalachian backcountry near Max Patch. He kept a journal, meticulous, detailed. Every day logged with time, distance, meals. The last entry read, "Saw myself today, standing by the creek. I didn't move, neither did he." They found Lewis's pack, his tent, his boots, but not Lewis. Over the years, more stories followed, always similar. A glimpse of oneself in the distance, an identical voice calling out from the wrong direction, a second shadow that didn't match the light. We spoke with a ranger. We'll call him Mason. He'd worked sections of the Appalachian Trail for over 15 years, mostly uneventful service. But in the spring of 2006, his routine changed forever. He'd been searching for a missing hiker, female, early 30s. She'd signed in at Klingman's Dome trailhead, but never signed out. Day 3 of the search, Mason was combing a ridge near the Sugarland Mountain Trail when his radio crackled. A woman's voice. Unclear, static choked, but calling his name. He answered. She responded again. Same name, same cadence. But something was off. The voice was a perfect match for the missing woman. But it wasn't panicked. It wasn't urgent. It was playful, too calm. He followed the sound, calling back every few minutes. The voice always stayed just ahead, never behind, never closer. He reached a clearing. The trees were thin there, brittle with wind and rot. And across the clearing, maybe 20 yards away, stood the woman, or something wearing her face. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there. He raised his radio, and she raised hers, in perfect sync. He took one step forward, she took one back, then he noticed her eyes, wide, fixed, too wide. The skin around them didn't move. There was no blink, no breath visible in the cold air. He froze. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked into the trees. Mason never found the missing woman, but for months afterward, he dreamed of that moment. Always the same. Her face, the clearing, the stillness. He eventually transferred out of that district, took a post near the coast. To this day, he won't enter the woods alone. Psychologists argue these stories stem from exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by isolation, hypothermia, or sleep deprivation. And yet the accounts are too consistent, reported by experienced hikers, rangers, even military-trained survivalists. One man reported hearing his own voice calling for help deep in the trees. He ignored it. Said it felt like bait, like a net had been cast, and he was just outside the edges. A woman hiking near Blood Mountain swore she saw a duplicate of her friend watching their camp from a ridge, while the real friend sat beside her, asleep. Even more disturbing, those who follow the figure too far sometimes report memory loss, disorientation, missing time. One couple hiked a loop trail that should have taken 4 hours. When they returned, they were told they'd been missing for nearly 2 days. They had no injuries, no explanation, just the growing sense that something had followed them back. There's an old belief in the mountains. When something in the woods wears a human face, it isn't trying to fool the body. It's trying to fool the spirit. A ranger from the Nantahala district put it this way: they don't want to become you. They want you to forget you're you. Then there's room. To this day, hikers are warned, unofficially of course. If you hear your own voice in the forest, don't answer. If you see your reflection where no mirror should be, turn away. And if you find yourself face to face with something that looks exactly like you, run. There are trails in the Smokies that never made it onto any official map. Some were once logging roads, long since reclaimed by the forest. Others, no one's quite sure when or why they were carved, but the locals know them, the rangers know them, and most won't speak of them out loud. They go by strange names, whispered ones, names passed in hushed tones between old trail workers or scratched into weather-worn signs barely hanging onto broken posts. Names like Crow Line, Dead Man's Gutter, the Hanging Path. One of the most talked about, though never in front of tourists, is a stretch near the Deep Creek area. They call it Needle's Thread. To a stranger, it looks like any other deer trail, narrow, winding, choked with undergrowth. But the moment you step onto it, something changes. The sound goes strange, the light flattens, and every step forward feels like walking deeper into something that knows you're there. We spoke with a ranger, one of the few still on active duty, who agreed to share a story, so long as we didn't use his name. He was new to the force when it happened, ambitious, curious, the kind who believed every warning had a rational explanation. One afternoon in late October, he was doing a solo sweep near Klingman's Dome. He came across what looked like an old animal path, overgrown but oddly defined. Something about the way the trees bowed inward, how the brush had parted. It didn't feel natural, but it looked intentional. He followed it. First 100 feet, normal. The usual forest sounds, birds, wind, a squirrel darting across deadfall. But after the bend in the trail, everything stopped. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his boots. He paused, looked back, could still see the main trail through the trees. That's when he realized he hadn't seen any signs of wildlife. No tracks, no scat, nothing. The deeper he went, the colder it got. Not just in temperature, but in feeling, like he was walking through a memory that didn't want to be remembered. About half a mile in, he came across something strange. A circle of stones, 6 of them, arranged too precisely to be accidental. At the center, a pile of feathers and moss, matted, decomposing, old, and surrounding it all were footprints, bare, human-looking, but wrong, too long, too narrow, and not leading to or from, just circling. He started to leave, but before he could take a full step, he heard something behind him, a footstep, clear, heavy, deliberate. He turned, no one there. He stood still, listening. Another step, this time, from his left. But the leaves didn't move. Nothing disturbed the underbrush. It was as if the sound came from beneath the ground, or just inside his head. He pulled his radio. Dead. No static, just silence. He retraced his steps. Fast. The woods seemed tighter now, closer, like they were folding in. By the time he stumbled back onto the marked trail, he swore the sun had dropped farther than it should have. Back at base, he checked the GPS log. He'd been gone 42 minutes. His watch said he'd only been gone 18. He never found the trail again. Other rangers have reported similar anomalies, not just there, but near Cold Spring Gap, along Forney Ridge, and deep in the Greenbrier section. Unmarked trails that shift, paths that appear for a day, then vanish, sections where compasses spin, electronics fail, and even trained search dogs refuse to continue. One local elder told us the truth, simply, those aren't paths for people. They weren't made by us, and they weren't made for us. In Cherokee tradition, there are places known as forgotten ground, sacred, but not in a holy way. Sacred in the sense that they are to be left alone. Trails that walk through stories instead of around them. Spaces where the land remembers what was done and what was never supposed to return. A former park anthropologist once cataloged a series of carvings found along a now closed section of trail east of Fontana Lake. They were symbols, deeply etched into stone, but aged in a way that suggested impossible antiquity. Even the moss avoided them. His report was shelved. The trail was closed, officially due to erosion. But ask any seasoned ranger, and they'll tell you erosion has never left claw marks in stone. No one patrols those paths now. They're left to the trees, and whatever still walks them. Hikers who go off-trail, intentionally or not, are sometimes found in places they couldn't have possibly reached on foot. One was discovered barefoot, 11 miles from where she was last seen. When asked how she got there, she just shook her head and said, "It wasn't me walking." The forest holds its secrets tight, and some trails aren't meant to be walked. Not by us. Not anymore. Among all the stories whispered in the Appalachian backcountry, there is one that unsettles even the most seasoned rangers. It's not a tale of beasts in the dark or of things that mimic the human form. It's quieter, stranger, and it begins always the same way, a soft knock on a tent. Just after midnight, the first reports began surfacing in the early 2000s, though it's likely the phenomenon predates that by decades, maybe longer. A camper, usually alone or in a small group, settles down for the night at a remote site. All is quiet. Then, tap, tap, tap. Not aggressive, not urgent, just deliberate. Sometimes the knock is followed by a child's voice, uncertain, polite. "Can we come in? We're cold. We're lost. Please, just let us in." But when the tent zipper is drawn back, if it is, what stands outside doesn't match the voice. They appear as children, yes, but too still, too pale, dressed oddly, clothes decades out of date, or subtly wrong, like a costume meant to fool someone who doesn't know any better. But the eyes, that's what freezes people, completely black, no whites, no irises, just endless, depthless dark, staring, not blinking, not quite human. We spoke with a ranger, retired now, who shared an account that had followed him for years. He was on a solo patrol one autumn, assigned to check backcountry campsites after a windstorm. It was like routine work. Mostly just noting down fallen branches, damaged signage. He'd reached campsite 18, a remote site near Deep Creek, and was settling in for the night when he heard it. 3 knocks, software even, as if someone was asking to come inside his ranger tent. At first, he assumed it was a hiker, someone off schedule. He called out, "Who's there?" No response. He grabbed his flashlight, stepped out, scanned the perimeter. Nothing. No footsteps in the damp ground, no sound, not even crickets. He returned to the tent, zipped it tight, told himself it was the wind, branches maybe, but 5 minutes later, again. 3 knocks. He froze, didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the voice. "Can we come in?" Software right at the edge of the canvas. He drew his sidearm, unzipped the tent slowly, and standing there, in the beam of his flashlight, were 2 children, a boy and a girl. The girl was barefoot. The boy had a tear in his shirt that looked deliberate. Both stared straight at him, expressionless. Their skin looked off, too smooth, too pale, and their eyes, black, all black. He told them to stay where they were, reach for his radio. It buzzed with static. The girl tilted her head. The boy took a step forward. "We're lost," the boy said. But the voice didn't match the movement of his mouth. It lagged, just a second behind. The ranger aimed the light directly into their faces. No reaction, no squinting, just more staring. He stepped back, told them to stay put, said he'd call for help. He turned his back for a second, just a second, to reach for the emergency beacon in his pack. When he turned around, they were gone. No footsteps, no noise, nothing. He searched until morning, found no trace. Later that week, he checked the visitor log. No missing children reported, no known hikers in that section that night. And yet, 2 nights later, a couple camping near Smokemont, 11 miles away, reported hearing a knock on their tent. Same pattern, same voice. "Can we come in?" They didn't unzip it, but they said the temperature inside the tent dropped sharply. Their campfire, which had been burning strong, went out in an instant. Their dog, a normally fearless black lab, tucked itself into the corner of the tent and refused to move. Some believe the black-eyed children are spirits. Others say they're something much older, older than the forest, older than people. They've been seen in other places too. West Texas, the Pacific Northwest. But the Appalachian encounters have something different, more frequent, more consistent. One theory comes from Cherokee oral tradition, referencing beings called Nunahai, spiritual entities who could appear in human form, sometimes to protect, sometimes not. The Nunahai were known to lure people into their world, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for years. In the stories, those who returned were never quite the same. Their eyes never adjusted to the sun again. We asked the ranger if he'd ever seen them after that night. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I never saw them again, but sometimes I wake up to 3 knocks and my tent's already unzipped." He doesn't camp alone anymore, and when he walks the forest edge at dusk, he doesn't look too closely at any small shapes in the distance. Not anymore. Because some things, they don't knock to be let in. They knock so you'll open. Deep in the southern stretch of the Smokies, where the land folds into itself like a clenched fist of rock and root, there is a cave almost no one speaks of. It has no name on any map. No signage points to it. Even seasoned hikers who pass nearby seem to glance away from that part of the ridgeline, as if something in them instinctively tells them not to look too long. But for those who have found it, accidentally or otherwise, there is one thing they all recall: the whispers. Not loud, not clear, but constant. Faint, overlapping voices. Too many to follow. None you can quite place. Always just beneath the threshold of understanding. The first official report came from a geologist surveying rock formations along an unfrequent slope near Thunderhead Mountain. He'd followed a creek runoff deeper than intended, and as the forest thickened, he began to hear it. At first, he thought it was the wind moving through the trees. Then he realized. The trees weren't moving. Still air, still canopy. But the sound continued. When he located the source, he found himself standing before a narrow cleft in the rock. Easily missed if you weren't looking. Inside, darkness, deeper and blacker than it had any right to be. He called out. No echo, only more of the whispering. He marked the coordinates, returned the next day with a ranger. That ranger was later interviewed, off the record. What follows is his account, transcribed from a personal audio journal recovered after he left the service. At first I thought it was just water, dripping, maybe, pooling into cracks. But when we stepped inside, you could hear them. Not voices exactly, more like breath with intention, like something trying to speak through stone. The geologist wanted to keep going. He had equipment, headlamps, ropes. I followed. The cave winds inward about 80 feet, then opens into this chamber, low ceiling, almost womb-like. On the far wall, we saw carvings, not graffiti. Old, worn into the stone like they'd been rubbed into it over centuries. Symbols, circles within circles, spirals, except not quite. More like loops that turn back on themselves. Some were shaped like eyes, others looked like teeth. There were handprints, small, too small for any adult. Some of them had extra fingers. We found bones, bird, rodent, one that looked human, child-sized, but old, brittle. Then came the sound again, only louder, closer, like it was coming from just inside the wall. I looked back. The geologist was gone. Just gone. I didn't hear him move, didn't see light shift. It was like he'd blinked out of the space. I shouted, got no answer. But the whispers got louder, not angry, not screaming, just urgent, like warning me, or telling me something I didn't have the language to understand. I left, fast as I could, didn't look back. The geologist was found 3 days later, naked, covered in shallow cuts and dirt, sitting upright at the base of a tree 5 miles away. He didn't speak for 2 weeks. When he finally did, he asked why the forest had so many mouths. No further excavation was done, but that cave, what the locals now call the Cave of Whispers, continues to pull in the curious. Some hikers report hearing it before they ever see it. A low hum, soft murmurs. Sometimes their names. One group claimed that when they approached the cave, their compass began spinning, not erratically. Perfect circles, clockwise, then counterclockwise, then still. Archaeologists with Cherokee heritage who reviewed images of the symbols were disturbed. They claimed the markings were not Cherokee, not even Mississippian, but something older. From a time before stories were written down. Before the tribes even had words for what lived in the high dark places. One symbol matched a recurring figure in oral traditions. A creature called Tsul Kalu, not a god, not a demon, something between. Known as the slant-eyed giant, he was said to live deep within sacred mountains. He heard all things, knew the secret names of plants and animals, and could whisper into the minds of those who entered his domain uninvited. The elders warned, "Do not listen if the stone speaks to you. What it says is not for you, and once you hear it, you do not forget." The Cave of Whispers was sealed off unofficially. A rockfall, coincidentally, blocked the main entrance a year later. But those who've heard it say the sound still carries. Through the trees, through the fog, through the ground itself. And if you're alone, and the wind stops, and the birds go silent, and you think you hear someone breathing right behind you, even when no one's there, you're probably close, too close. There's a figure known by many names in the hidden language of the trail. Some call him the Long One, others simply He Who Walks Behind. But most who've seen him, and there are more than a few, refer to him with uneasy brevity, the Shadow Man. No official documentation exists. No photos, no footprints, no samples. And yet, he's reported across nearly every stretch of the Appalachian Trail, from Georgia to Maine, from day hikers to through hikers. Even rangers, trained observers, have come forward, though reluctantly. His appearance is always similar: a tall, impossibly slender silhouette. No discernible features, no eyes, no face, just height and stillness. He doesn't speak. He doesn't run. He watches. He follows. And the feeling he brings, those who've encountered him don't describe fear in the usual way. It's not adrenaline. It's not panic. It's a collapse, a dropping away of certainty, a weight in the chest, as if the forest itself is holding its breath, because something has stepped into it that does not belong. One such encounter comes from a ranger assigned to a high-traffic stretch near Klingman's Dome, an area known more for tourists than terrors. It was early spring and the snow was still patchy in the higher elevations. The ranger had been clearing debris off the trail, marking weathered signage. Routine, unremarkable, until the quiet set in. He described it later as too quiet. No birds, no wind. Not even his own breath seemed to echo. Then, about 30 feet ahead on the trail, he saw a figure, motionless. At first, he assumed it was another hiker, but there was something off about the posture. Too tall, the shoulders too square, the arms too long, hanging down past the knees. And the figure, he realized, wasn't casting a shadow of its own. It was the shadow. The ranger called out. No answer. He moved forward slowly, but the figure didn't move. Then, he said, it began to tilt. Not walk, not lean, tilt, like a tree being pushed by wind no one could feel. Not toward him, just slightly sideways, as if it was listening. That was enough. The ranger turned back, but the forest didn't return to normal. The silence remained, and he had the unmistakable feeling that he was being followed. He kept walking, mile after mile, not running. He didn't dare. When he finally reached the ranger station, he looked behind him. Nothing. But the silence stayed with him for days. And the nightmares? He didn't talk about those publicly, not until years later when he met another ranger. A man who'd served in a completely different section of the trail. They'd never crossed paths professionally. But over coffee one evening, the second ranger said something that made the blood leave his face. He said, "Have you ever felt like the woods were waiting for something? Like something tall was behind you, just at the edge of the trees?" And then he added, "And it tilts its head." That night, the first ranger couldn't sleep. He stayed up, rereading field logs from the years he'd served. And in several of them, spread out across seasons and states, he found references buried in the margins. Phrases like, tall figure in the trees, observer. Eyes felt, not seen. Shadow where there shouldn't be one. I was alone, but I wasn't. So what is the shadow man? A shared hallucination? Some say yes. The Appalachian Trail has long stretches where isolation can cause visual and auditory distortions. Sleep deprivation, altitude, loneliness. But the accounts often happen to people in pairs, sometimes even groups, people who agree on the details without ever having spoken to each other. Others think it's folklore catching up with reality, a projection of old fear into modern wilderness. But there is a third explanation. Among the Cherokee, there is a belief in shadow watchers, spirits that live between the trees. They do not interfere, they do not harm, but they watch. And when a person has seen too much, stepped too far off the path, they are marked. The legends say, they will not chase you. You run because you are afraid. But they never needed to move. They were already where you were going. Some rangers refuse to speak of the shadow man. Others insist they've never seen him, but still refuse to hike alone after dusk. And there are stories of hikers, strong, healthy hikers, who abandon the trail entirely after just one glimpse. Not because they were hurt, not because they were threatened, but because they understood whatever walks out there in the dark has always walked, long before us and long after. There are places in the Smoky Mountains where the air feels thinner, not in the physical sense, though altitude may play a role, but something else, a thinning of the real. Locals have a name for them, thin places, where the boundary between this world and another is not so firm, where you might see things that don't belong to this time or this place. And if you're unlucky or unwise, you might even walk through. One of the most whispered about stories among longtime residents and older rangers involves what they call the Lost Village. It's not marked on any map. No historical records confirm its existence, and yet the stories persist across generations, counties, and dialects. A village with no name, hidden in the folds of the forest, sometimes seen, never twice in the same place. The people who live there, that's where the stories start to fracture. Some say they're spirits. Others say there's something older than that. Not dead, but never quite alive. Not people, but something wearing the memory of people. The most detailed account came from a ranger who had been posted along a remote southern stretch near Fontana Lake. He was chasing a lead, a call from an older hiker who reported seeing strange lights through the trees at dusk. Lanterns, the man claimed, dozens of them, moving steadily through the brush in a straight line, no trail, no sound. The ranger hiked out the next morning. No footprints, no sign of encampment, but he felt, pulled, toward a gap in the trees he couldn't remember being there before. Past it, the terrain changed. It was subtle at first. The moss on the rocks was thicker. The air was warmer than it should have been. Even the birdsong faded, replaced by the distant sound of bells, software, tinkling, like wind chimes without wind. Then he saw it, just through a break in the trees, rooftops, stone walls, smoke rising gently from chimneys that hadn't seen modern fire codes in 100 years. He thought he was hallucinating. He walked forward slowly, one foot dragging behind the other, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There were people, moving quietly through the village center. Their clothes were strange, threadbare and handmade, like something from the early 1800s. But their faces were wrong, too still, their eyes too black, like dolls that had learned to move. One woman turned to him and smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the mouth. But her eyes didn't change. She raised one hand and beckoned. He stepped back, and, as he did, the light shifted. The trees closed in, and the village was gone. He stood there, blinking in the normal forest, surrounded by silence. He tried marking the spot, took GPS coordinates, photographs. None of them saved. The files were corrupted. The coordinates led to an overgrown ravine with no sign of a settlement. Later, when he told his story to an elder in a nearby town, the man simply nodded and said, "Some places don't belong to here, and sometimes they forget they're not supposed to be seen." There are other accounts. A pair of hikers who found themselves on a cobbled path that wasn't on their map. It led to a stone archway, and through it, they saw flickering torches, voices murmuring in an unfamiliar tongue. When they turned around and looked back again, only trees. One solo backpacker wrote in a journal that she woke to find her camp surrounded by quiet houses. She thought she was dreaming, but in the morning her gear was wet, as if she'd slept on cobblestones instead of soil. These stories all share a theme. Once seen, the lost village does not let go of you. Those who find it, or are found by it, report recurring dreams. Dreams of dirt roads, creaking wooden doors, rows of faces watching from darkened windows. Some become obsessed, trying to return, mapping their hikes, marking times of year, phases of the moon. But none ever find it twice. One folklorist described the phenomenon as a classic temporal mirage, a trick of the mind formed by stress, light, and environment. But even she admitted, there are too many details, too much consistency between stories separated by decades and geography. Either they're all sharing the same hallucination, or something very old is still moving through the mountains. And always, that same warning from the old-timers. If you see a town that shouldn't be there, with faces that don't change and windows that don't blink, don't go in, and above all, don't answer if they call you by name. Somewhere between the third strange call and the second time he forgot what day it was while deep in the backcountry, the ranger stopped thinking of the Smokies as just another post. He'd arrived like most did, well-trained, skeptical, confident in procedure and reason. The mountains, after all, were part of a job: trees, trails, wildlife, manageable things. But now, all these years later, he no longer walked the ridgelines the same way. His boots still found the worn tracks, his gear still packed with clinical precision. But his eyes wandered more, to the gaps between trees, to the slow bends of the streams that ran a little too cold in summer, to the moments when the forest went silent, completely silent. Because that's when it was watching. He doesn't tell the new rangers much, not because he doesn't want to, but because they won't believe him. They never do. At least, not at first. They'll hear the stories, laugh at them, brush them off during training exercises or night patrols, until something happens: a misplaced tent, a missing hour, a whistle in the dark when no one's around. And then they stop asking questions. They start leaving little offerings, like the locals do: a folded leaf, a smooth stone, salt, anything to acknowledge them without saying too much. The ranger spoke once at a town hall meeting after a teenage boy vanished without a trace while trail running near Klingman's dome. He said only this: "This place has memory, and it remembers how we treat it. Some things here aren't meant to be fixed or found. They're meant to be left alone." After that, the calls to search deep into off-limits areas slowed down. People still went missing, but fewer people went looking where they shouldn't. He never used the word haunted, not even privately, because it didn't feel like ghosts, not in the way books or movies describe them. This felt older, more awake, like the forest itself was choosing when and where to let you through. The trail was never just a trail, it was a vein, carrying more than hikers and wildlife. It carried history and something else, something still listening. He shared a final story once, quietly, to a visitor who'd come back asking about the lost village. He said he woke up once while on patrol, middle of the night, far from the ranger station, and someone had rearranged the stones around his fire, not scattered, not kicked, arranged, into a symbol he didn't recognize, perfectly circular. At its center, one of his own socks, soaked and neatly folded. He packed up and left by first light. Didn't speak until he was back at base. When asked why he didn't report it formally, he just said, "Because whoever or whatever did that already knew where I was. A report wouldn't change that." And now? He walks with reverence, not fear exactly, but something close. Respect. For the voices behind the wind, for the eyes in the branches, for the faces that sometimes appear between one step and the next and vanish before you turn. He offers one final warning for those listening. The campers, the backpackers, the thrill seekers, and those who come looking for the strange. Do not mock the stories. Do not call out into the dark, and above all, if the trail seems to move beneath your feet, if it leads you somewhere your map doesn't know, don't follow. Some paths are made for forgetting. Some doors aren't meant to open. And some things that walk these woods are just waiting for you to step too far. The Appalachian Trail is still there, winding through trees and ridgelines and forgotten places. It still calls to the wild-hearted, still promises peace. But if you listen closely, beneath the rustle of leaves and the song of the birds, something else is calling too. And not all who answer come back the same. You've walked the ridgelines with us, felt the silence that follows a name whispered by something unseen, heard the stories passed through firelight, through trembling voices, through reports that never made it to public record. These weren't just tales, they were warnings, reminders that the world isn't always what it appears to be, especially not where the trees grow too close, where the paths vanish behind you, where time bends without notice. Out here, on the trail, myth and memory breathe the same air. And this is only the beginning. If you felt that chill at your back, if your curiosity's been stirred by what waits just beyond the firelight, then don't stop here. Subscribe to MindFuel. Because the woods are vast. The voices are still calling. And the secrets buried beneath moss and stone are far from finished with us.